test. All right, so people are beginning to join us. And great. Wonderful. Oh, we do have some call-in listeners. That's great. All right, I'll make an announcement. Hi, everyone. My name is Reverend Doris Dalton. I am the Director of Leadership Development and Intercultural Competency from the New York Conference of the United Methodist Church. This is the webinar sponsored, hosted by the New York State Council of Churches. We'll be talking about reopening houses of worship and social justice today from 3 to 4:30. We're not beginning quite yet.
Right.
Nice to see you. We're not beginning quite yet. We'll begin at 3 o'clock, and when we do, we'll be recording. And Peter Cook is the mod. I unmuted you, Peter. Can you?
Yeah. Hi, Ron. Thanks. Welcome. Good to have you here. And I know Chloe's getting on, and I'm just waiting for Reverend Holland, and I think we're good. Go ahead.
Okay.
Hello. Hi, Tom. Hi, Peter. Hi, everyone. You're on mute, Peter.
Hey, Jim. Good to see
Hi.
your face.
Unmute.
see you,
Hi,
Tom.
Jim.
Hope
Good
you're
to see
well.
I am. This is, well, we're all dealing with crazy days, so I apologize. I've just gotten off 2 urgent phone calls. So thank you for the texting me, Peter. I had it, obviously I was going to be on, but I realized I need to be on now. So.
Yeah, sorry about that.
I've got a few people that somehow don't seem to have this email, so I'm just.
And there are 3 Peter Cooks on the screen at this
Yeah,
point.
Ron, your list is Peter Cook.
I am. How would that happen? I am no longer Peter Cook. Not impersonating anyone but myself right now. Can't hear you, Peter.
Chloe, you need to rename yourself. You're listed as Reverend Peter Cook. Can you click rename at the top?
Yeah.
Okay.
The joys of Zoom.
All right, we're almost 2 minutes away here.
Quite a crowd you've got.
Yeah, it's just insane. I've got 600 people registered. Although I don't know if we're going to get 600, but
I wish I could get half of that.
well, I've never had this happen in my life, so.
That's because you have Tom on the call. And
Yeah, that's it.
all Methodists who are signing in.
Oh, there we go. Hi, Reverend Holland. How are you?
Yes, I'm fine. How are you doing? How you doing, Peter?
Good. For some reason, everybody's named Peter Cook. If you could rename yourself in your rename to put your name up, that would be great.
Okay, I hope I can figure that out. I'm not much on Zoom here. Let me see.
Okay.
A little blue box on the corner of
Yeah.
your picture. If you put your cursor over it, you click it and it should say rename.
Okay, it is, hi everyone, I'm Doris Dalton. I'm part of Bishop Bickerton's staff. It is 2:59, so I am about to mute myself and turn off my camera. Matthew Curry is also on. He is also the Director of Connectional Ministries for the New York Conference. So the two of us will be working like in the background. There's a little bit of feedback.
Ouch.
I know. I'm just gonna. Sorry, I'm starting to mute everybody to make sure it's not coming through again. I'm gonna mute myself, turn my camera off, and I will start the recording. So Peter, I'll be in the background. If you need anything, just say Doris, help.
Okay. So we're at 3 o'clock. We'll give it one more minute. Welcome everyone. Okay. I'm the executive director of the New York State Council of Churches, and it's really my pleasure to welcome everyone to this webinar, which will examine reopening houses of worship and economic justice, New York and national perspectives. I really want to acknowledge to all of you that this is a full call. Right now, we're trending at 342 participants. We had over 600 people register for this call. And unfortunately, once we hit the 500 mark, we're not going to be able to have others come in. So we will be doing a follow-up call. We are recording this call, so you will be able to access that in this way, and we also will try to do some follow-up in terms of questions that get posed here, because we might not be able to get to them all. We're going to, as a format for the first hour, invite our panelists to offer some reflections for about 5 minutes or so. And then no later than 4 o'clock, we're going to go to the Q&A section of our time. And we'll try to take a full half hour to answer your questions, and we'll direct that to different panelists. And you're, of course, also welcome to put comments in the chat, but if you have a specific question, it's best that you put it into the Q&A. So we are going to mute everyone here for the call. And when you ask your question, if you could please put your name and affiliation as well, so we have a little context for who is asking the question. We also really want to be committed to respecting all people on this call. We hope that we're not going to have unwelcome friends here who want to disrupt the call, but if you notice anything that is disruptive, to please direct your questions to Doris privately in the chat and say, hey, I got a concern, or something along those lines. We're here to, again, respect all people on this call. The call today will deal, of course, with some very practical kinds of questions, but we might not get to all of those. We have published extensive guidelines from most of our denominational partners on our website, and we ask you to refer to those. But again, in terms of super specific stuff, we'll try to address them in follow-ups if we can't get to them in this call. What we do want to do today particularly is to focus on some larger theological questions, to reflect on the challenges that we're facing in terms of implementing guidelines, and also to address economic justice concerns. We are here to offer some reflections, not in a comprehensive way, but to provoke you to think more deeply about how you are working in your particular context. We have participants from every part of the state on this call. So you're going to have to adapt these answers to your own context, but we hope that we can provoke you to do some of your own thought with regards to that, as opposed to just giving you some cookie cutter answers. We think it's appropriate that we're doing this in an ecumenical way together. You know, every denomination has posted their own guidelines, but I think what we can do as the body of Christ is to connect with one another and to shape a common witness and build some community. So we're happy to be able to take this opportunity to do that. I just want to finally say, as we enter this seminar, that we're really keenly aware of the grief and the anger that our country is going through as it copes with the death of George Floyd. The picture of an officer placing his knee on the neck of Mr. Floyd is a tragic metaphor of the situation that we face here as a country and as a state. While most police do their best to protect us from harm, we know that there is a long history of police brutality towards people of color, which needs to be addressed with our words and with our laws. But I think this knee on Mr. Floyd's neck is also a metaphor for the suffocation experienced by so many Black people, Black and brown people in our communities who've been disproportionately affected by this pandemic. And so we need to acknowledge that as we're going about trying to address issues around coronavirus. But as we as a church seek to reopen our buildings, we also have to be equally attentive to the economic suffering that so many people are experiencing, with a disproportionate shift of wealth to the top, with not as much wealth going to the bottom to address real economic needs. And if we're going to reopen as communities of faith, our first priority is to attend to those needs in our community, to reach out, to listen, and to really address laws and policies that are preventing people from being lifted up. I'll just note that tonight in New York City, clergy have been invited in as essential people to listen to people's concerns and to be beacons of peace. And I really think that that probably is a model for what we need to be doing in all of our communities to reach out to others and take their cries seriously. So with that, I'm going to say a prayer. Let us pray. Gracious God, we are so mindful of your Spirit and the ways in which you call on us to seek justice at this time. We pray for each and every person in our community who is hurting right now and who longs for words of love, of hope, and justice coming from the church. Bless our conversation. Help us to listen well and appreciate the diversity of voices that we are going to hear today as we seek to do your faithful will. And we ask all these things in Christ's name. Amen. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Jim Winkler, who is the President and General Secretary of the National Council of Churches. So Jim, welcome.
Thank you, Peter, so much. And thanks to New York State Council of Churches for convening this webinar. I confess that I was tempted to tear up my remarks and address the national crisis in front of us. And in fact, even this morning and afternoon, I've been in phone calls and meetings with church leaders literally from all around the world who have been sending their deepest concerns about the unraveling situation here, and with other church leaders in this country who want to convene high-level meetings to try to address the situation. But in this instance, I've been asked to say a few words about the national scene on the reopening of churches, and I'll stick to my writ. And I do this in my capacity as President of the National Council of Churches, which is a diverse covenant community of 38 member communions representing some 30 million Christians in approximately 100,000 local congregations across this country. They include Protestant, Anglican, Orthodox, Evangelical, historic African American, and living peace traditions. I'm unaware of a single instance to date in which any of our churches have claimed that public health orders restricting groups of people to gather in the face of the coronavirus represents undue regulation of, or persecution of, or violation of religious freedom. Although our churches have not been gathering physically in sanctuaries, we have been worshiping. We have been singing. We have been praying. We've been reading sacred texts, and we've been expressing our faith through the spoken word. This has been done online primarily. In other words, church has not ceased. The freedom to worship is a value of the highest order, and many people naturally seek comfort and support provided by our faith communities in these difficult times. The right to practice religion freely does not include liberty to expose the community to a communicable disease. Several weeks ago, the National Council of Churches held a webinar featuring Dr. Robert Redfield, the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Our participants wanted guidance on reopening their churches. When exactly could they reopen? What about choirs and congregational singing? Other questions had to do with, should we have outdoor services? Would that be safer? What about cleaning sanctuaries and restrooms? What about church ventilation systems? How long does the virus linger on a hymnal, and so forth? Now, Dr. Redfield offered common sense advice. Stay 6 feet apart, wear masks, use hand sanitizer. But he did not provide specific starting and opening dates. He didn't even provide a lot of information related to singing, for instance. People were frustrated on that webinar. What we organizers of the webinar did not know was that at that very time, there was a behind-the-scenes struggle between the White House and the Centers for Disease Control about releasing just such guidelines for churches. And once they were approved, the White House demanded that the Centers for Disease Control remove guidelines about singing in church. So here's the real deal. We love God and our neighbors more than we love our church buildings. While the president is demanding that we get back into our church buildings, he cannot make us put the health of our people at risk any more than he can turn day into night or night into day. When it's safe, our churches will resume worshiping together in our church buildings, but not until then. We will not be pawns in this matter. Religious freedom gets used and misused every day. Just last night, the President of the United States had peaceful demonstrators in front of the White House forcibly removed so that he could walk across Lafayette Park and wave a Bible while using St. John's Episcopal Church as his backdrop. The Episcopal Bishop of Washington, Reverend Mary Ann Buddy, denounced the use of St. John's Church as a prop and the use of tear gas to clear the area. She reminded us that God is love and that everything Donald Trump has said and done is to inflame violence. We need moral leadership, and he's done everything to divide us, she said. Well, friends, it's our task. It's our task to knit the nation together during this crisis. Thank you, Peter.
So, at this time, I'd like to introduce to you the Reverend Tom Bickerton, who is the resident bishop for the New York Conference United Methodist Church. So welcome, Tom.
Thanks, Peter. And let me just say thank you to Jim for your remarks. I couldn't agree more, and appreciate, Jim, your clear, concise, and prophetic leadership in times like this. We really celebrate your role in the National Council of Churches, and it's great to see you. It's great to be on this webinar, and I'm thankful for the opportunity. You know, as a leader, I always attempt to check and balance everything I do around core principles or a foundation of who we are or what we're wanting to achieve, what we believe, and how, by the grace of God, we reflect God's presence in all that we say and do. For us in United Methodism, we've lived for over 200 years with a set of very simple core values or rules that guide our thinking and acting on a very basic yet strongly foundational way. Our founder in Methodism, John Wesley, put it simply: do no harm, do good, and stay in love with God. Those core principles, along with our vision in New York to create safe places where everyone is accepted and welcomed, are really the drivers that inform everything from our reopening policies and guidelines on one hand to our response to the events around George Floyd on the other. It includes our plea for people to listen clearly to what's really being said by those who have been disproportionately affected by COVID-19 and the longstanding issues of systemic racism. This has widespread implications that are related to economic security, healthcare, work environments, living environments, deep issues of inequality fostered by deeply ingrained white privilege, not to mention the health and safety of our people as they think about returning to in-person worship and ministry, which I think is so desperately needed at this point, given the events of the last week or so. And I'm sure, as I'm sitting here, that it's true for you as it is for me. It's all so confusing. This seems to be a multi-dimensional 3D chess game of sorts that has lots of interwoven and interlocking features that make it impossible to cover all the bases. And yet, in the midst of it all are these guiding principles: to do good, to do no harm, to stay in love with God. You know, to deeply love God with heart and soul and mind and strength, and to, in response to that love for God, turn and point that same kind of love to our neighbor, recognizing that the word neighbor in the context out of which we live means that we have to find ways to listen more deeply and affirm more significantly those who are not being heard, those who are sick, and those who are marginalized at times confessionally by the same organization that should be at the forefront of love, the church. To do all that is really difficult, but it is our mandate. It's who we are, to deeply love God, to keep that love at the center of who we are, and then turn and point it to our neighbor, recognizing that our role is to keep people safe and to listen deeply and to be people of love. We all know that that's complicated, but we also know that it's our mandate. We will do everything we can to keep people safe and protected from the virus in our reopening strategies. And we will do everything we can to not ignore the clear cries for us to be at the forefront of dismantling racism and calling for justice in the midst of so much evil that's around us. I guess my words to all of us today is just a word of encouragement to stay focused on those core principles that drive us as Christian leaders. I know that there are economic problems in especially our small membership churches, and people are just desperate to get back together for economic reasons. I want people to be desperate to stay away, as Jim said, to continue to celebrate the fact that none of our churches have really closed, to stay away until the stage is set appropriately for us to regather, and to do so with safety. And now to do so with a clear mandate that there are issues that are being broadcast loud and clear across this country and across this world that we have to be mindful of, that give us a deeper purpose for that regathering in person. Finally, in terms of my remarks, I just want to take the opportunity to express my gratitude to be on this call, because I believe that it gives all of us on this call an opportunity to state what should be obvious, but what I've often discovered is greatly neglected. We need each other desperately, in moments like these especially. And we need each other to bear witness to our unity as a people of faith, and to work very deliberately and intentionally to help one another listen and act in ways that will not be patronizing, but pastoral, and not placating, but prophetic. And I value the opportunity to walk on that journey with you. I'm grateful for this time. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Tom. I so appreciate those pastoral words along with Jim, and just the reminder that we as a church need to be a witness right now in such a difficult time. It's always been the case, and it always will be the case. This time I'd like to introduce Reverend Chloe Breyer, who is the Executive Director of the Interfaith Center of New York. So welcome, Chloe. We got to.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you. It's a great honor to be here today, and thank you for New York State Council of Churches for putting this issue out there in a way that's allowing so many people to get the information that they need, given all the confusion that we have had to deal with for the last several months. And I wanted to, I work as the executive director at the Interfaith Center of New York, and as an Episcopal priest, I'm also on staff at a church in Harlem called St. Philip's. And I want to speak today, particularly from the perspective of having worked in an organization that's been doing interfaith work in New York City for over 2 decades. Because, what an exciting city it is to do interfaith work. And now having both been at the Interfaith Center shortly after 9/11 and seeing how that situation, both brought out the best and the worst in all of us, that we too are given both a challenge and an opportunity when it comes to reopening out of the COVID-19 epidemic as houses of worship. I recall, Peter, looking at that set of guidelines that the governor has issued, the New York Forward guidelines about suggested steps that we as faith leaders can take in our congregations to begin that opening process. And was really struck by the question of, well, how do these guidelines affect so many of us who live in New York, maybe who are not Christian or who come from other faith traditions, and yet share our civic identity and so many of the values, and give our city so much vibrancy. And I am speaking now from the perspective of New York City. What we've come to see is it's not just about being inclusive as the kind of, sort of, which is the right thing to do, but also the really important gifts that we may not always bring to the table, that often people from other backgrounds or faith traditions do. And I'm thinking now of the Sikhs in New York, our friends Hardiel Singh and the United Sikhs, who were among the first to head out to Elmhurst Hospital when they realized that those health workers were not having time to stop and eat and feed themselves. It was something I think that we, a couple months or so back, it's the intensity of the work that they were doing didn't leave them time to care for themselves. And it was the United Sikhs and others who stepped forward and said, let us just do that work of feeding our frontline workers. And part of that has to do with something that's really essential to the Sikh tradition, this idea of the langar, which has existed for hundreds of years, where you go into a Sikh gurdwara, which is their temple, and immediately you are fed. That is just part of the Sikh tradition. It's so important as a gesture of hospitality. It's sort of the coffee hour on steroids, if you will. And that's important because we've got to make our neighbors be able to bring their gifts to the table. At a time like this, when we are so much in need, we have to enable people, not just of our own faith traditions, but of others, to bring their gifts to help our wider society. So that's why when we looked at those guidelines from the New York Forward, it was particularly important, I think, that we hear, the vast majority of people from New York are Christian. But there are so many, particularly in New York City, but also in other parts, that are not. And I think when we're thinking about how to open our churches, we want to, and faith, houses of worship, we want to consider their impact. I just remember also on that call, Peter, that we had looking at those guidelines, somebody who represented 80 mosques in New York saying, well, how do we get the money to actually do 8 cleaning times a day? Where do we get the PPE that this quite rightly says? We've got people in our congregations that are working around the clock or are facing unemployment. And again, this isn't unique to any particular tradition, but we want to be able to make sure that we offer the resources for communities to be able to abide by those guidelines, and not just assume that every house of worship has the ability to pay for and buy the things that we need to reopen. So again, that just was a bit of, those are 2 little anecdotes that come to my mind. And I just want to, again, hope that as we move forward, we can keep inviting people to the table that we might not otherwise do, because they are our neighbors as well, and we need them. So thank you so much, Peter, for this opportunity.
Grateful for you to talk about the hospitality that is so important at this time. And that kind of caring that builds up relationships when so many relationships are getting destroyed right now. So this time, it's my pleasure to introduce to you the Reverend Joseph Holland, Esquire. He's a pastor and an attorney. He is the executive director of the 400 Foundation, and it might be helpful, Reverend Holland, if you could say a little bit about what that is, in addition to your remarks. So.
Thank you so much, Peter, for convening this very important gathering, as well as I'm hearing a lot of echo, but I will press forward here. For convening this very important gathering, as well as including me, to make a statement.
Reverend Holland. This
Yes.
is Doris Dalton. Reverend Holland, are you calling in on a phone? You're not? You're not calling in on a phone?
No, I'm calling on a laptop.
I think the feedback is coming in through maybe your laptop. I wonder how that's happening.
You may try to make sure you turn, when you're talking, perhaps turn down your volume on your computer. That might help.
Okay, let me do that. Okay, I turned down the volume on my computer. Did that help?
It's wonderful. So please begin again.
Okay. All right, so let me proceed. I'm sorry, I apologize for that technical difficulty. I had the volume on my computer up too high. As executive director of the 400 Foundation, I'm working with a group of primarily African-American clergy, helping to bring about positive economic change in communities of color. The context for my brief commentary are the two interrelated crises plaguing America: the public health crisis and the criminal injustice crisis. These crises are interrelated because of the wide-ranging and complex influence of racism in this nation. Let's start with the public health crisis. In New York City, COVID-19 deaths among African Americans were over twice the rate of such deaths among white persons. Additionally, there are disproportionate economic implications. Yes, workers across all racial and ethnic groups have suffered greater unemployment because of the pandemic's lockdowns, but Black workers are more severely impacted because they are overrepresented as essential workers on the front line, thus exposed to the coronavirus. Compounding the public health implications are the criminal injustice repercussions, stemming from legacies of slavery, Jim Crow, and more modern forms of racism, resulting in African Americans being 2.7 times as likely to be killed by police than white people. Also that unarmed Black Americans are roughly 5 times as likely as unarmed white Americans to be shot and killed by a police officer. So as the church reopens in the midst of COVID-19 and in the post-George Floyd murder season, a biblical reference is imperative. Jesus' parable from Luke 10 states that a man victimized by a brutal crime was in need of help and received it from a man of a different culture. But only after 2 religious men, the priest and Levite, had passed him by, leaving him lying in need. We in the body of Christ have treated those disadvantaged and hurt because of racism in much the same way. We have just passed by, leaving them lying and in need. We must do our best to not act like the priest and the Levite of Luke 10. We must pay special attention to those disadvantaged by racism and do our best to work together to meet their needs. Let me conclude with some practical steps. As we reopen, white and Black churches should worship together. A creative example of this was a recent Sunday collaboration between Carl Lentz of Hillsong Church in New York and T.D. Jakes of the Potter's House in Texas. A very compelling collaboration they had. I have the link to this initiative if anyone is interested. White and Black churches should also work in outreach together. I know this collective outreach is effective because of my own ministry, Holistic Hardware, which I have been working in Harlem for many years. You can find out more at myholistichardware.com. And I also want to challenge each of us with some individual steps concerning racism. First, be analytical about racism. Don't ask, was the act racist or not? Let your question be, how much racism was in play? Maybe it was 5% racism in the motivation, or 15 or 50%. Consider this statement, how much racism was in play. Be relational about racism. Seek out a diverse group of friends and listen when people of color talk about their perspectives and experiences. Be prayerful about racism. Find a quiet space to meditate on your conscious and unconscious biases. Be intentional about taking this race-conscious inner journey. And finally, be strategic about racism, as Jesus advised in Matthew 10:16, when he stated, "Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves." Thank you once again, Peter, for this opportunity, and I look forward to sharing more with you.
Thank you, Reverend Holland, for those powerful words and for reminding us of the importance of working together, reaching out to one another at this time. So often as a church, we are very siloed, and this is not a time to do that, given the crisis before us. I'd like to now introduce to you Bishop John Macholz, who is the Upstate New York Synod for the Evangelical Lutheran Church. And John, just curious if you might talk a little bit about your reflections working in, not so much in New York City, but in Upstate.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks for the invite to be present with you and with all in this distinguished panel. Upstate New York Synod, so you have an awareness geographically, is everything from Sullivan and Dutchess County north of those county lines and the remainder of New York State. I'm privileged to serve 165 congregations in the metropolitan areas of upstate New York, as well as in the very rural areas. It's a very diverse synod as regards that reality, as well as political realities that sometimes can be challenging, but is always a gift to be able to be present with God's people here. I'm going to start briefly with a letter that I sent out on May 22nd that will become quickly self-explanatory, I believe, to the people of God here. Nobody wants to be with the people of God in person more than I do, and nobody is more concerned about the safety of the people we are called to serve than me. I mean that sincerely. Today, when I learned via 3 emails and a communication from staff, all within about 10 minutes, that the president had decided to deem houses of worship essential and that they should be open this weekend, regardless of the numbers, at what appeared to be the last moment, I was stunned. While Governor Cuomo allowed for groups of 10 or less, this far exceeds those bounds. I cannot imagine that anyone is in place to open their buildings that Sunday and head in that direction, even if the total number of people was 10 or less. I cannot believe that anyone has done any of the cleaning and disinfecting necessary to welcome people back to worship. Maybe someone has a plan in place and is ready to implement it, but I could be wrong. I have not heard of a single person or a person in position who are ready to throw the doors open and announce that we are back to business as usual, whatever that was or is. I can say that what I have drawn from staff and pastors and congregations around the Synod in my conversations over the past weeks is that there is a strong consensus that most are not only not ready to go back to worship right now, but will find it difficult to do so before the 1st of August at the earliest. The vast majority of pastors that I have spoken with in this Synod are not ready to jump back into worship. A number of our pastors, as I think is true across the board, and those who are religious leaders, are in the category of being vulnerable, age-wise and health-wise. And there is concern not only for the people that we serve, but there is a concern among clergy for the fact that because they are a vulnerable group, or part of the vulnerable group, are they going to be forced to go back into a space that they don't want to be in at that point in time? As Bishop Bickerton has said, my goal is the safety and care of all of God's people as God calls us to love one another and to care deeply for one another. We're in a position where we are in the midst of two traumas. One, the pandemic of COVID-19, and the other, the pandemic of racism that has been underlying that in this country for 400 years. People are not going to be walking back into our sanctuaries ready to engage immediately. People, if they do come back, are going to be fearful of what they're going to encounter. I know that I was out for a walk the other morning and I ran into a woman who I knew who approached me and began to talk to me. She's a good friend and I've known her for years, but I have to tell you, I was a little afraid of being that close to her. I think our people are in the same space. And so for Lutherans, my recommendation will be, as I meet with our council presidents tomorrow evening and next week, that when we do go back during phase 4 and we start in smaller numbers, that we will go back with a simple service of the word. And we will use that first month minimally to simply be together to pray in a simple way, to find our way to do the social distancing, to wear the masks that are necessary to be worn, and to work through the trauma that we have been going through and experiencing over these past 10 to 11 weeks. I think it is going to take time simply to heal the wounds that have existed in this pandemic, in both of these pandemics. We will open slowly and carefully, following the dictates of the CDC, the ones pre-White House approval, as we move forward and have conversations about how to create safe space, how to sanitize space, how we afford to do that, how frequently we do that, and what that looks like. We will have conversations about singing, which will most likely not happen in our congregations because of the CDC guidelines and recommendations. And we will have conversations about how to move forward slowly and carefully, especially ask the question of how we care for those who, because of their age or their economic status in life or their location, do not have the capacity to work with the technology that is present in our world today that is not available to them. We cannot, at this moment in time, move toward a position of greater exclusivity as we move toward what we perceive to be an opportunity for more inclusivity of in-person worship. As the church, we are called to care for all of God's people and all of God's children. How we do that will make a mark on how we carry out the ministry as the church in our future, among all of our people, whether we're Lutheran or Methodist, whatever the color of our skin or our ethnic background or our beliefs. We are called to care for God's people. And caring for them means loving them deeply, moving beyond our own needs, clearly understanding their needs, and finding ways together to move forward and to be the church and presence of God in this hurting and desperate world. I look forward to working together with all of you, as together we, as the Council of Churches, both New York State and national, find our way forward and continue to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is central to what we are doing. Thank you.
So that would have been a nice speech to give in front of St. John's Episcopal Church yesterday, Bishop Macholz. So thank you. I'm going to turn now to my friend and good colleague, partner in crime, Ron Deutsch, who is Executive Director of the Fiscal Policy Institute. I'm going to give you about 10 minutes, Ron, if you can, to kind of get us into the public policy realm here around economic justice and budgets as it relates to the state and federal levels. So please be our guest.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you all for having me. It's always a pleasure to work with my colleague, Peter Cook, and the New York State Council of Churches, as well with many other faith groups that we work with throughout the state on a regular basis to make New York a better state for all of its residents. I'm going to just walk through a couple of slides here, if I can, for you, and just talk a little bit about some of the problems New York is facing. I will try and be as quick as possible. But, you know, COVID-19 has certainly laid bare a lot of the inequities that exist in New York. There's no question about that. They've been there for a while. But right now, we know that over 2 million New Yorkers have applied for unemployment insurance since this pandemic began. And the budget cuts that we've been talking about at the state level could threaten as much as another 250,000 jobs. And let's keep in mind that the people we're talking about right now, 98% of those applying for unemployment are folks earning less than $68,000 a year. And really what we've seen is this has only sharpened the inequality that exists in New York State. We are a tale of two New Yorks, a tale of one city and one state of great wealth and another of poverty and racism and systemic barriers to achieving opportunity. So we know that the billionaires in New York are doing exceptionally well right now. Their income is going up while the incomes of others are going down. And we also know that this has really laid bare the real racial inequities that exist. Not only racial equities, but also economic inequities, socioeconomic inequities. It's really been Black and brown families across the state who have felt the impact of this pandemic more than anyone, disproportionately so. And those very people are also the ones that are our frontline workers, our essential workers, providing us what we need to survive day in and day out. You know, they are our heroes, yet we ask the billionaires to come in and help us figure out public policy when we should be asking those most impacted to help us figure out public policy changes. Right now, you know, we live in a state where the top 1% gets 44 times that the bottom 99% statewide. We have the worst income inequality of any state in the nation. It has been rising over the past few decades, with the wealthy capturing even more wealth. And again, I mean, this has really brought our state to a sudden halt at this point, even though this downturn has not hit all New Yorkers. One thing to keep in mind as we discuss the budget in a second is the fact that the governor really has gotten some special powers in this budget. I wouldn't say of biblical proportion, but I would say that, you know, the governor really has the ability to decide what cuts to make, where to make those cuts. And then the legislature has a mere 10 days to basically design their own plan or to respond to the governor's plan. So right now we know the governor has been making a lot of assertions about the budget. Right now, you know, we started off the year in a budget hole, and now things have just escalated to an astronomical point. We're looking at $61 billion in lost revenue through 2024. We're looking at closing a gap for this year's budget of about $13 billion. That's going to require an additional $10 billion in cuts. And we're talking about cuts across the board, cuts really of about 20% to education, healthcare, human services, transportation, aid to local government. So this is really getting bad right now. And we've actually frozen about $1 billion in spending already. So $370 million in aid to our upstate cities that are already hurting and devastated by COVID-19. And they're also suffering from astronomical child poverty rates in many of our upstate cities. Areas like Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, Utica, the Capital District. I mean, we have child poverty rates ranging from 35 to 50% or more. So this is only going to make matters worse. And then we're already seeing proposed cuts by counties to a lot of nonprofits that are providing services on behalf of the state and county to those residents. So we really have to ask the question now is, will these nonprofits even survive and be around to provide these services when the need for them is greater than ever before? We're also working under a 2% state spending cap. Many of you may have heard this before. But the reality is it's had a harsh impact on human service programs across the board, the very programs we're going to need now more than ever. But the reality is that the 2% cap, which has been in place for a decade now, has resulted in about $2.2 billion less in spending on human services on an annual basis than we would have been spending normally. So right now, our big play, right, the governor is waiting on financial aid, or federal aid, I should say. I'm waiting on financial aid for my students. But the governor has been very clear. He wants, and quite frankly, New York deserves relief from the federal government. But at this point, right now, the best case scenario is looking at $34 billion in aid to fill a $62 billion hole. So we're never going to get all the money we need from DC to help close this gap. So we need to take other measures, and we have to acknowledge that. I mean, the state and local governments, in particular local governments as well, are looking at upwards of $3 billion in lost revenue right now. And they're going to have a really hard time delivering services. So the question is, what do we do without federal aid, right? We have some options. We can borrow from the Federal Reserve Bank, we can create new revenue sources, or we can cut spending, or we can do a combination thereof. We would suggest that, there's a three kind of pronged approach here that we need in New York. One is we absolutely need federal assistance to the New York State. There's no question about that. But we should also borrow from the New York Federal Reserve Bank's municipal liquidity facility. It was set up for this. And we should be generating new revenues from the ultra rich among us. The Federal Reserve Bank is providing up to $500 billion in lending to the states. We can borrow up to 20% of the revenue that we raised in 2017. This could give us in the neighborhood of $15 to $20 billion that we could borrow short term to get us through this crisis. And we need to get through this crisis without making massive cuts in services. Because again, let's remember, who is going to be impacted by these cuts? It's not going to be the wealthy. They're going to be just fine. They will not feel the impact of 20% cuts to public schools, to housing, to healthcare, to human services. But the majority of New Yorkers will feel that pain, and it's going to be devastating, I can assure you of that. So what we need to do is look at different ways to raise revenue and ask those at the very top. We live in a state where so few have so much and so many have so little. It's patently unfair. So there are a number of bills on the table right now that are sponsored by Assembly and Senate members. We should be looking at a billionaire's tax, asking billionaires to pay a little bit more. We have 118 billionaires in New York with over $566 billion in wealth, $500 billion in wealth. We could tax them just a little, and guess what? They'd still be billionaires. So, this isn't going to be a problem for them. We also are seeking additional top rates on the personal income tax at $5 million, $10 million, and $100 million. You have to know that if you're making over $5 million, $10 million, or $100 million in this environment, you're doing exceptionally well, and you can afford to pay a little bit more. We're also looking at taxing second, third, fourth homes valued at over $5 million. We would like to see the stock transfer tax reinstated, which is a very small tax on stock trades, but it would generate $13 billion in revenue. Right now, we collected it for 75 years. Now we collect it and rebate it instantaneously to the same brokers that paid it. So, you know, there are things we can do without question that we must do. And in times of crisis, the governors have asked for shared sacrifice, whether it was FDR and Herbert Lehman, Nelson Rockefeller. We had Speaker Silver and Majority Leader Bruno come together in a bipartisan way and override Governor Pataki's veto of a tax increase on the wealthy after 9/11. Governor Patterson created a millionaire's tax after the financial collapse. So there is precedent for this. And quite frankly, it is the norm, not the exception. So, you know, the legislative leaders are very reluctant to raise taxes on the wealthy. Cynical people might suggest that's because those are the very political donors that they rely on. Thankfully, I'm not cynical, but I would suggest that research and polling has indicated, especially from the Hart Research poll, that 1,000 registered New Yorkers, right, 90% or more favor all three of the taxes I mentioned: the billionaire's tax, increasing income taxes on the wealthy, and imposing a tax on luxury second homes valued over $5 million. 90% of people support that, and 72% said that they would be more likely to vote for a member of the legislature that supported all three of those. So the biggest thing we get hit with whenever we talk about the wealthy being taxed is that they are going to move, right? They're packing up the U-Haul truck and leaving New York. But in reality, that hasn't been happening. And since we enacted the millionaire's tax in 2009, we've seen an 83% growth rate in the number of millionaire tax filings in New York. We saw 10% more millionaires in the first year it was imposed, 30% in the 2 years after that. We know that the comptroller reported that millionaires are least likely to move. You know, billionaires can live wherever they want. They're not worried about the tax rates. And they choose to live in New York because they want to be in New York. So this notion that they're all going to flee is quite ridiculous and unfounded. And I think, you know, the reality is that we have to continue to be vigilant and talk to our legislators about the need to generate revenue in a responsible way. I believe it was Matthew 19 that said that it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. So I would suggest that, you know, we need to make sure that we unburden the camel so that those at the bottom can be prosperous and have access to opportunity as well. So thank you.
So I'm going to now turn it over to Reverend Kaji Dousa, who is the senior minister at Park Avenue Christian Church and also co-chair for the New Sanctuary Coalition. So Kaji, about 5 minutes or so. Yeah.
Wait, they got 10.
Yeah, I'm going to move it a little past 4 because we're not inundated with questions. So I'd like to, okay.
All right. So I just first of all want to acknowledge the collective trauma that I know that many of us are coming to this call with. COVID was the start, and then now the rest of the nation is groaning. And we just had someone last night stand in front of a church, Bible in hand, basically declare civil war on his own people, my people. And as I begin my remarks, I just want to say Black Lives Matter. So I spent the weekend here in New York City supporting, I'm a local church pastor, and I spent the weekend here supporting people who have been part of nonviolent resistance right now that very much I think is getting at the points that Mr. Deutsch has made, because we need to completely rethink how we are funding and living and budgeting and prioritizing. We all know that budgets are moral documents. But what I want to say is that with this uprising, I think we're noticing a pivot in the ways that we understand gathering at all. And so here we are talking about, like, what do we do in opening churches? But I just want to say, and I'm just going to share a photo really quickly from the uprising I was part of on Friday. Here you see, you all see this, right? Here we see a group of us who are at Foley Square downtown in New York City. We are standing, this was, you know, an uprising protest about the killing of George Floyd. And what you can see here, the person who's standing with the bullhorn is Gwen Carr, who is the mother of Eric Garner. And I don't know if you can see me behind there. I'm wearing all this PPE and everything with the shield. And so this kind of thing where you see we are obviously not socially distant, it is almost impossible to do social distancing and protests. So all these protests you're seeing, nobody is apart, which means these are all going to be super spreader events. And I'm going to stop my share, stop share here, and just say that it's kind of bizarre where we have all these people coming together, right, in this uprising, and then church is trying to figure out like how we're doing worship. I haven't quite figured out how to handle that dissonance in my head, but we do have a call, as Peter mentioned, from the city for clergy to come out. And you can't hear me? Are you all able to hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, sorry, we have a note in the chat that someone can't hear me. Okay, so we do have a call from the city for clergy to come out and support this, support people during the enforcement of this curfew. And I just want to point out what a big deal this is, because New York City has not had a curfew since 1943. This is the first time in that long that we have had a curfew. And we already know that the enforcement of any kind of rule disproportionately goes to our people. So the idea that we as clergy need to go outside to protect people from the NYPD is really, really difficult. No, I'm gonna take my full time, don't worry. But anyway, so curfew is a big deal, and we are actually hosting a call at 4:30 to talk with folks who can help us and just go out and figure out if you're able to put your body on the line to help us. And the other thing I want to say about the uprisings is that I note the economic impact that we want to talk about. I think all of us should pay attention to. I know many of you are heads, or judicatory heads. And we know that in Minnesota, that the congregations were warned that particularly Black churches and synagogues would be targets of violence, and that there is national concern about that. Apparently NYPD is telling us we don't have current credible threats, but we do have some threats. And so we want to understand what the economic impact is on congregations that could be targeted by the white supremacists who are co-opting this uprising moment to, as the Minnesota and Minneapolis police have said, to really foment more rage in Black communities and other targeted communities. So this picture is much bigger than how we handle worship. And the issue isn't just going to be in New York City, it's going to be across the state as more and more people get upset. So I just want to bring that in the room. As far as opening, I think that the opening is our action. Like, we're already open, we're doing church, we're being church, where 2 or 3 are gathered. Thousands and thousands are gathered right now in our streets, and being able to offer a presence to that, either in our homes where we witness, we boost, we talk about it, we bring it up, we say Black Lives Matter, even though we may have never said that before. It really matters. The other thing, and by the way, we saw that St. Patrick's Cathedral was sprayed with a Black Lives Matter sign. If we don't put up the sign, somebody else probably will. So just think about that. My congregation, Park Avenue Christian Church, has made a long-term commitment to not gathering in person for worship because we're finding plenty of enrichment in online worship, and we've been doing it for a very long time. So we do have incredible content on our YouTube page and on our website. We encourage you, if this has been a struggle, use our stuff. You know, you're welcome to use our stuff. So like if you want to take our songs, you have my permission. If you don't feel like preaching because it's exhausting to try to do online worship, take a sermon, just put it up. You may not like what I say, but you're welcome to use whatever content we have put up there. You have my permission for that. And I think more congregations should be talking about how we share these things because it is exhausting to put together, and many of us don't even have those skills in our places. So we should be sharing. Our church is, however, so while we aren't planning on in-person worship, we are planning on opening our space for city services and core services for the community. And so, for example, we'll be opening up the congregation as a cooling center for people who don't have air conditioning. In a summer, we're anticipating being quite hot. We also want to be the city is offering or asking for congregations to be, and I bet a bunch of other places are as well, to be distribution places for PPE, and they will give us the PPE and then we can distribute it either in our buildings or go out and give it to people. The name of the church is Park Avenue Christian. So we continue to do our weekly community lunch program, and we have kept that up. And so, you know, the services continue, but figuring out ways to worship together, you know, the Holy Spirit can go wherever we are. So never stop being church. Let's see. Oh, I wanted to point out, I'm a local church pastor, and much of our income actually comes from rentals. Not as much from giving, and particularly from the film industry. So we are very eager to be able to make use of our building again for that use. And, you know, I know that it's very complicated for many of us who have a nursery school we rent to that isn't getting its income that it needs. And then what do we figure out with that and all of that? So I just want to acknowledge that a lot of us whose income is related to rental need to think through what that looks like. And we encourage the city and the state, as they call on congregations to offer help, to actually pay for it. So I wanted to say that. And how would we pay for it? I think one of the things I encourage Ron and others to talk about is really rethinking how we budget in cities. The New York City Police Department has a $6 billion budget, which is probably about $2 billion more than we spend on education. So obviously it is the biggest budget in the budget, and you see what's happening. I hope you see it, and I hope you're looking. But that can be reallocated, drastically reducing that to put it towards social services and to the services we need for, especially for our kids who are out on this street, who've been locked up for months in their homes and now are watching people with police officers with their knees on people's necks who look like they could be their brother. I mean, that sort of thing, of course they're upset. So I think the uprising is going to continue for quite some time. And if we don't actually start to rethink how we allocate those tax dollars, then there's going to continue to be uprising. Like here in New York City, we cut summer youth employment, which is, the kids will really now have nothing to do. But congregations could be employed to make use of summer youth employment dollars if we reinstitute that, and give these youth something to do, give them training and mentorship and leadership and jobs. So those sorts of things, I think if we're creative in figuring out how we can partner, I think that would be really, really helpful. But I want to close where I started, because I imagine there are people on the call, and hi everyone, who don't understand why we're seeing what's happening. So I have to close by calling some names. And I will just say personally that I don't want any more hashtags, and I don't want to be a hashtag either. And we don't want people to have to be in the streets mourning our names. But if we can't breathe, which is George Floyd, if we can't be trans, which is Tony McDade, if we can't bird outside like Christian Cooper, if we can't jog like Ahmed Aubrey, if we can't be home like Botham Jean or Atianta Jefferson or Ayanna James, if we can't get help like Jonathan Farrell and Renisha McBride and Corey Jones and Terrence Crutcher, or hold our phone like Stephon Clark, or leave a party like Jordan Edwards and Oscar Grant, or play loud music like Alton Sterling, or walk from the corner store like Mike Brown, or play on a playground like Tamara Rice, or go to church like the Charleston Nine, or wear a hoodie like Trayvon Martin, or hold a hairbrush like Sean Bell, or survive a traffic stop like Sandra Bland and Philando Castile, or shop at Walmart like John Crawford, sit in a car like Keith Scott, walk like Clifford Glover, decorate for a party like Claude Reese, ask a cop a question like Randy Evans, cash a check in peace like Yvonne Smallwood, take out our wallet like Amadou Diallo, run like Walter Scott, breathe like Eric Garner, or live like Freddie Gray, then nothing is going to change. So it's Pentecost, and God brought not just fire, but God also brought winds of change. And I pray that we celebrate and move into that wind instead of resisting it. Thank you so much for the time.
Peter, you're on mute.
Oh, I'm C. Thank you. So, Jim, we got about 20 minutes left. I wanted to just circle back to you again, just for the national perspective on the legislative stuff, and then I'm going to open it up and try to. So, if you could, just.
Okay.
Whatever summation you'd like to offer.
I'll keep it very brief. And first, let me just say how much I appreciate not only all the speakers, but thank you, Koji. Just love to be in your presence. The National Council of Churches offers its strong support for the people who have taken to the streets in grief and anger over the continuing epidemic of police violence. We're also saddened and dismayed by the heavy-handed and at times violent response for the police. And therefore, we're supporting H.R. 4359 in the House of Representatives, the Police Exercising Absolute Care with Everyone, or PEACE Act, which was actually introduced last year and is intended to raise the standards for use of force by law enforcement officers. And after all, the utmost obligation of police is to respect and preserve human life. Nearly 1,000 people a year are killed by police in the United States. Last year was no exception. I want to turn also just for a moment to the deepening economic crisis. We are working with Catholics and evangelicals and people of other faiths to push Congress to increase SNAP, that is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, minimally by 15%. Hunger is surging at an alarming rate. We have, meanwhile, it seems, turned inward in this country. And so we're also pushing for no less than 0.2% of our gross national product to go to support the World Food Program and World Bank projects and international assistance. And now we have an election right in front of us. And so we have been urging support of the HEROES Act. Most states, I apologize, I'm not sure that we're concerned about the integrity of elections. Let me then turn my attention to one last thing. I'm just trying to cover a few things real quickly here. I don't want to read an entire document for you all, so there's maximum time for Q&A. But we are supporting the HEROES Act because most states which have to balance their budgets by July 1 are going to be forced to cut community services and lay off workers in healthcare, first responders, and teachers. And this has to be counteracted, and really only Congress can provide the kind of assistance needed to stave off this this crisis. So again, I just wanted to mention those things because we at the National Council of Churches work closely with and are part of the Washington Interreligious Staff Council. These are a variety of Christian, Jewish, Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist groups that have working groups and are constantly pushing Congress to work for justice, to advocate for justice and peace, and to adopt laws that will alleviate the crisis in our country. So thank you, Peter, for turning back to me. There's so much going on. It's just absolutely unbelievable. And we've got to somehow, in the midst of all this, support one another, work at the local, state, and national levels, and be on the streets.
Okay, thank you, Jim. So we've got about 15 minutes to work with some questions here. I thank everyone for writing in, and I am going to pick this up now, right at the top. The first question that was asked was, my biggest question is, when are groups larger than 10 allowed to gather? So I'm going to take a bite at that apple. I don't think we know. I think that I serve on the governor's advisory group, and I think that, you know, we're really looking at phase 4 as a place where we might see a little more significant opening. I don't see us going above 10 until we get to phase 4. And then from there, those numbers probably are going to go up very slowly. But as it's going to vary a little bit region to region based on what phase you're in. But you know, I don't think that you're going to have total clarity on this. John, you're in Upstate. I'm curious if you might take a crack at that question.
My understanding, Peter, is that we are talking about phase 4, and it'll be an incremental by week or weeks process moving forward from 10 to 50 and then to 100 after that. I think it's just it's gonna take time to see how it plays out and how we find ways to carefully make sure our spaces are clean and we're caring for all of our people in the best way we possibly can moving forward.
Okay. Thank you. The next question was, would you please clarify the face covering guidelines? Somebody like to try that one? I don't know, Tom, or those of you who are in the practical implementation business here.
Well, I listen to the governor's press conferences every day, and he talks repeatedly about masks everywhere. And that's the guidance we're giving our people, is that when they anticipate coming back together, that masks are required by participants. We've encouraged pastors, for example, to consider putting up plexiglass in front of the pulpit so that they can perhaps preach without a mask, but no singing because of transmission. We're even saying that in the creation of our outdoor guidelines, that masking is the requirement. And I think that's just the standard that we need to pursue. What we're trying to do with the United Methodist Churches is provide each local church with enough masks for those that come not prepared to wear them, and to also deal with what are the scenario planning around what happens when someone comes who refuses to wear a mask. So we're trying to cover all the bases, but the standard is masks for everyone at all times.
I'd love to hop in here too. One of the things that I've found here in the city where, you know, walking down the sidewalk, people are very close, and I find the face shields to be incredibly helpful. Also, when I'm speaking in front of people, I like to wear that instead of just the mask, because it still protects them and it also protects me. So the face shields are not particularly expensive. I also encourage Black church pastors in particular to do what I've done, which is invest in these. This isn't for worship, it's just so you have them. I think it's important. They're hard to get, so you have to take some time. And I can't believe I'm even recommending this, but I want to be transparent. We need to get these. and we probably need to get them for our folks. So these protect from tear gas. They also protect from coronavirus and other things, just as the situation devolves.
Kaji, can you give us some counsel on how to acquire those? You said they're difficult.
Yeah, it takes a while, but you can order them. They are currently available on the major retailer sites like Amazon, which I hate to say out loud, but it is true. Amazon does have these.
Thank you. I'm just going to go back to the 10 per minute and pick up something in the chat that says this person is a little confused, thought the guidelines said no more than 10 people. Does that apply to phase 4? My apologies for the redundancy on this. So the 10 people is the stopgap until we get to phase 4. When we get to phase 4, then that's when a lot of our guidelines for our churches kick in, which have a little more of a staged process. But the answer is we don't really know much until we get to phase 4 about what we're going to be looking at. The 10 is really an arbitrary sort of number that was picked. You know, they would admit that as sort of a stopgap and not until we get to phase 4. Okay. So will there be printouts available after the seminar? Yes. After the webinar, we will put them up on our webpage, nyscoc.org. This person, James Renfrew. Okay, Chloe, go ahead. Did you have a question?
No, I just in light of the last couple questions, and something that Kaji said about, you know, the overall framework being that what this has enabled us to do is recognize church beyond the building and be reminded of the core of who we are is, you know, is the body, and whether the body is present primarily online or primarily in the building, you know, that's kind of, I don't think we have to equate the return to the building, whether it's in June, July, August, September, or none of the above, as the true way of being. Like, I think, you know, it seems we have a kind of range of opportunities. No one's going to be perfect, but that we've got to get a kind of workable cleaning and participation regime, and we're working our way back to that. I don't seem to think we're in, you know, we don't have to be in too much of a rush, because we've also, those of us who are lucky enough to figure out how Zoom works, and that's certainly not everybody, are able to gather. So within that framework, I think we relieve ourselves a little of the burden of getting it perfect in terms of our reentry, and instead enable ourselves to look at some of these wider questions. Again, I think the work of jobs for young people, particularly in New York, is just so critical given everything that's happening. Not one aspect of it, but everything. And the summer we're looking at without 75,000 jobs for young people is almost scarier than anything we've seen yet, not to be alarmist. But there's a great opportunity there as well to find allies, to find meaningful work for young people that we desperately need in our congregations and beyond. So I just wanted to offer that.
Thank you, Chloe. This very important question is from James Renfrew. He says, I serve a rural congregation in Western New York where adherence to health guidelines began well. I'm now in the middle of a divisive, i.e. political debate about when to open. Some want to open yesterday, some want to wait a long time, but pastors are at the middle of this, possibly becoming lightning rods. Any observations on this? Well, you know, Tom or John or Joseph, I'm kind of curious what you think. Working with pastors who are trying to navigate this.
I also saw Jim nodding his head. I'm just wondering if, Jim, you've got some insight.
Yeah.
Well, it's very interesting to me how many of the questions have already dealt with this matter, and this is consistent with a webinar I was part of several weeks ago. And I have to say, I think that we run the risk of the question of when a local church is going to reopen being almost as divisive as other critical issues that are facing some of our denominations. I don't want to draw the direct parallel between this and, say, for example, human sexuality issues, but it's almost feeling that way. That, I mean, people, they love their churches, and that means the buildings too. And we can separate, if we want, the notion that the church is not the building, but we've invested an awful lot financially and emotionally in these buildings, and we have a lot of memories and a lot of occasions in our lives attached to them. And it's frustrating that none of us really know the answer because some people are clear. I have heard pastors say, I am not going back until there's a vaccine, until I know that most everybody is immune from this virus. And I've heard others, as we all have, who have said it's all a hoax. And there's no need for all of these extreme measures. And there's not, in my mind, a clear middle ground right now. I do think that those of us who are part of denominations really do need to listen to what our denominations are suggesting as guidelines. And then if your church is independent, then you've got to work through that. But in addition to and let me say this, I think all of our denominations, as best I can tell, are paying very close attention to what public health authorities are saying. So we all have to be educated in our own lives about when and where to wear masks and who to be in contact with. And similarly, collectively, we have to take care of our local churches. I don't know if that helps, but I mean, I'm really struck by how powerful this issue is for so many of us, and it's not going to go away.
I noticed on the chat that someone said, blame your bishop. John may come after me on my response to that, but I would agree with it. As a denominational leader, I don't mind being the heavy, and I have to run interference so that my pastors can lead. The second thing that I would say is that I'll hearken back to my comments. I want to ask anyone who wants to reopen why. Give me a theological reason why. Tell me how your understanding of God's grace and love would lead you to want to open a church again and risk bringing a deadly disease when we are called to be people who are mindful of soul, spirit, and body, the holistic approach of how we care for one another. And thirdly, I, as a denominational leader, have unfortunately a bank of stories that I draw on. I have a church, when I early on shut down our United Methodist churches, I had a church in the west side of Long Island, defy that and reopen. The pastor got infected, 10 parishioners were sent to the hospital, and the rest is history. I have another illustration of a church that served a meal, and the person that was preparing the meal was infected and infected a wide swath of the congregation. So there are classic illustrations out there about why not. And throwing caution to the wind is not a statement of faith. It's just an ill-advised, self-centered approach to reopen a building. I don't mind being the heavy in coming down and saying this is why we're closing. No questions asked.
So Reverend Holland, you represent congregations all over the state of New York, and I was just curious if you had a reflection. Many of your churches don't have the benefit of a bishop who you can blame. Does this question resonate with you? And can somebody unmute Reverend Holland? Doris, there you go.
Yes. Yeah, I'm here. Could you repeat that?
Yeah, I'm just curious if your pastors, you represent congregations all over the state of New York, and I'm just wondering if your pastors are getting a lot of pressure to reopen or find themselves under stress trying to navigate different political things in their church, and what advice you might offer to them.
Yes, Peter. We are under the same kind of pressure in terms of reopening. Many of our pastors, need to have the engagement in order to keep their congregations going, in order for financial and funding concerns. So yes, and what we're advising them is, we need to comply with the state regulations. And in the meantime, we have been advising them and even consulting with them to some extent on how to do virtual worship, how to go online. Some of our smaller members do not have let me say the background or the technological capability, and we have our larger churches do, but the smaller ones don't, and we have been working closely with them in order to get them up to speed technologically, so that there can continue to be fellowship, as well as the kind of worship online, and to keep the congregations going. So that, I have to say, has been one of our biggest challenges right now. But we have been working closely to help them survive virtually until there can be a physical reopening.
Okay. We're at 4:32. If you'd like, I'm gonna take one more question, and then we are going to follow up to all these questions in writing, and there will be a recording of this. And we are thinking about doing a follow-up forum, which might be built more around some of these questions. The question is from Denise Stone: can you provide links to ecumenical reopening guidelines or supplemental email to people who are registered with those types of links or aids? And the answer is yes, we're thinking about that. And then one other question, regarding opening the church, in a sense, from a church in a rural upstate village with very little diversity, does anyone know of ways we can build relationships and join in conversations with other churches from more demographically diverse areas? That's from Richard Fisher. Would somebody like to answer that?
I'm not sure what the question is, Peter.
Well, it's really, this is a rural community that doesn't have a lot of diversity, they say, and wanted to know how they could build relationships or join in conversations with other churches from more demographically diverse areas. Some of you represent denominations that, really stretch have a lot of geographical diversity. Maybe you'd like to reflect on that.
I was just, thinking about, something that you could say. Yeah, just.
I guess I would say if they have a bishop or a similar person position in place, that they be in touch with that individual and ask them to help them make that connection. I mean, it sounds like they're going to have to move beyond the rural setting toward the more urban areas, and may need some assistance in doing that as they try to move toward a greater diversity and understanding what that means for ministry in their church. I don't know if that makes any sense or not, but that.
I would agree with that completely, and would add to that, in many respects over the last month, I've been saying things like, quote, we will never be the same again. The new normal is something that is yet to be discovered, but it's going to be radically different. And what that means for me is that I think the younger generation, for example, has been pleading for denominations to demonstrate what they have in common rather than what separates them. And it would seem to me that part of the answer is a greater sense of ecumenical awareness that leads to deeper conversations, utilizing the gifts that we all have across the breadth of the places that we serve. I'm privileged to serve 427 congregations that include all of Long Island, Manhattan, and the Catskill Hudson Mountains. And the opportunity for us to engage across those geographical boundaries in meaningful conversations about how we move forward into a new normal, whether it be how we dismantle racism or how we reopen our churches, should be a high priority for all of us, especially those of us who are judicatory leaders.
I just want to add to that quickly that I agree exactly with what Tom said, and I believe, and I have said across this synod for the past number of years, I believe our future as the Christian church is rooted and grounded in our ecumenical relationships. And if we fail to follow through on that, we're going to fail as the church.
Exactly.
I would just close by saying that in New York, we deal a lot with sort of this upstate, downstate divide. I think we have responsibility as pastors to address those prejudices frequently and realize that the people who struggle in New York City have struggles that are very similar to the struggles of people in rural communities, like broadband access, for instance. That's a problem all over. Or, the number of percentage of people who have to spend too high a percentage of their income on housing is roughly the same, whether you're in the Bronx or in a rural community as a percentage of income. So, and then I just think in terms of dealing with diversity, don't neglect looking right out your door at who is in your community and not assume that everybody's the same. And reach out to churches that you might not have ever reached out to and offer how you could be of help or assistance, and recognize the diversity of experience and pain in your own congregation as well. All right, well, we're going to close up here, but I want to just say again, this is recorded. I am thinking about scheduling another seminar in a week or so. We'll be back in touch with folks about that. And we are going to attempt to post some things online and address some of the additional questions which were posed here. So I want to thank everybody for being on this call and to our panelists, and God bless you all.